Have you ever wondered why your path crossed with someone who seemed emotionally unavailable? It wasn't simply a random encounter. You entered the life of an avoidant during a deeply significant emotional chapter. More often than not, it happened at the point where they could no longer keep genuine intimacy at a safe distance without facing the emotional consequences. Your presence interrupted the familiar patterns they had depended on for years to protect themselves from vulnerability. You were never meant to rescue them. Instead, you unknowingly reflected the very truths they had spent much of their lives trying not to face. People with avoidant attachment patterns rarely form deep relationships by chance. On a subconscious level, they are often drawn toward individuals who awaken the attachment wounds buried beneath their emotional defenses. You represented closeness that didn't demand control, and that combination felt both comforting and deeply unsettling. Where they had learned to rely on emotional distance, you offered warmth. Where they had survived by withdrawing, you created a sense of emotional security. For perhaps the first time in a long while, they experienced feelings that refused to stay neatly locked away. They couldn't simply suppress or compartmentalize what they felt around you. That is why the relationship often seemed so powerful, unpredictable, and emotionally confusing. The connection carried an intensity that neither of you fully understood in the beginning. You weren't constantly pursuing them or overwhelming them with emotional demands. In fact, your calm presence gave them enough safety to move closer on their own. Yet that same emotional safety activated fears they had spent years keeping buried. You became both a place of comfort and a reminder of everything they feared about true intimacy. Your role in their life was to expose an internal conflict they had been carrying for years. Deep down, they long for meaningful connection, yet they fear becoming emotionally dependent on another person. They want to experience love, but consistency can feel unfamiliar and even threatening. They dream about closeness, yet when it finally becomes real, anxiety begins to replace excitement. Your presence brought this contradiction into clear view. Many avoidant individuals build an identity around being completely independent. They convince themselves that they don't truly need anyone and that relying on others only leads to disappointment. Without realizing it, you challenged that belief simply by existing in their world. Around you, they experienced what it felt like to be understood without losing themselves. They felt emotionally recognized without feeling controlled. That experience quietly shook the foundation of the self-protective identity they had carefully constructed. From the perspective of attachment psychology, this is often described as attachment activation. It refers to the point where a person's natural emotional needs begin rising to the surface, even when years of defensive habits have been working to keep those needs hidden. Avoidant individuals do not suppress these longings because they lack them. They suppress them because, at some point in their lives, expressing those needs became associated with emotional pain, rejection, or disappointment. It's important to understand one thing. You were never the source of their fear. Those fears already existed long before they met you. Your presence simply illuminated emotions they could no longer ignore. The distance they eventually created was not proof that you meant nothing. In many cases, it reflected the exact opposite. Sometimes, the reason an avoidant withdraws is because the connection became too emotionally significant to manage through the coping strategies they had relied on for so long. Their retreat wasn't evidence that your value was small. It was often a sign that your presence touched parts of them they had spent years trying to keep hidden. When an avoidant partner begins to pull away, it is often because emotional closeness has started breaking through the protective walls they have spent years building. Their need for distance should not automatically be mistaken for a lack of care. More often, it is the strategy they rely on to calm an overwhelmed nervous system. Stepping back is their way of regaining a sense of emotional balance and control when intimacy begins to feel too intense. Your presence disrupted that familiar sense of control. You entered their life to introduce them to something they rarely experienced: a relationship built on genuine emotional connection rather than emotional games. You didn't represent the excitement of chasing someone unavailable or the confusion of mistaking instability for passion. Instead, you offered something far more meaningful, a calm, steady connection grounded in emotional openness and consistency. For someone with avoidant attachment patterns, that kind of relationship can feel surprisingly unfamiliar. Their past experiences often taught them that closeness comes with emotional risk. As a result, what most people experience as safety can feel unsettling to them. Consistency may seem suspicious. Reliability can be interpreted as something that eventually leads to disappointment or loss of independence. Even healthy love can trigger discomfort because it challenges everything their nervous system has learned to expect. Your emotional steadiness didn't simply affect their thoughts. It challenged the way their body responded to connection. Many avoidant individuals have spent so much of their lives adapting to emotional unpredictability that calmness feels strangely foreign. Chaos once became familiar, and familiarity often feels safer than peace, even when it isn't healthy. Because of that conditioning, genuine emotional stability can mistakenly register as something uncomfortable or even threatening. You brought a sense of peace into the relationship, but their nervous system wasn't prepared to recognize peace as safety. Instead, it interpreted that unfamiliar calm as a signal to become cautious. Their instinct was to create distance, not because your love lacked value, but because the emotional experience exceeded what they had learned to comfortably tolerate. One of the reasons you crossed paths with them was to bring hidden patterns into conscious awareness. Your relationship reflected emotional needs they had ignored for years. It exposed grief they had buried beneath independence. It highlighted survival strategies they had accepted as normal without ever questioning them. Most importantly, it revealed how often they disconnect emotionally as a way to protect themselves from vulnerability. Many people with avoidant attachment are remarkably self-aware on an intellectual level. They can explain emotions, discuss psychology, and understand relationship dynamics with impressive insight. Yet understanding feelings intellectually is very different from fully experiencing them. Emotional knowledge does not automatically translate into emotional openness. Your connection reached beyond their ability to analyze. It activated responses at a much deeper level within their nervous system. That is why logical explanations suddenly seemed insufficient. They struggled to understand why they were pulling away from someone who treated them with care and consistency. Even they couldn't always make sense of their own reactions, because what was happening wasn't driven by conscious thought alone. It was the result of deeply rooted attachment patterns that had been shaping their responses long before the relationship ever began. Your presence awakened emotions they didn't know how to manage. Simple acts of affection exposed vulnerability they had spent years protecting. Genuine care made them feel responsible in ways that felt overwhelming. Love itself stirred fears of future pain and loss. Rather than moving closer to those feelings, they relied on the coping strategy they knew best, creating distance. You entered their life as a reflection, but not of your own identity. You reflected the parts of themselves they had been avoiding for years. Through your relationship, they caught a glimpse of their ability to experience real intimacy. At the same time, they were confronted by their fear of relying on another person and the emotional cost of constantly keeping others at arm's length. Many avoidant individuals choose to leave emotionally before they ever risk being left themselves. Taking control of the ending often feels less frightening than remaining vulnerable. Pulling away seems safer than opening their heart completely. Silence feels easier than difficult conversations, and emotional withdrawal appears less risky than honesty. Your presence quietly challenged every one of those protective habits. Your purpose was never to persuade them to remain in the relationship. Instead, you revealed what genuine commitment would actually require. Staying would have meant showing up emotionally, accepting responsibility for difficult feelings, remaining consistent even when discomfort appeared, and allowing themselves to be truly seen. For someone whose nervous system equates vulnerability with danger, that can feel incredibly overwhelming. You also challenged one of the deepest beliefs many avoidant individuals carry, that emotional distance is a sign of strength. In reality, real strength often requires the willingness to take emotional risks, to stay present during discomfort, and to trust another person despite uncertainty. They had spent years believing independence was the safest path, while your presence gently exposed the loneliness hidden beneath that belief. Facing that truth can shake the very foundation of how they see themselves. The reality is that most avoidant people are not afraid of love itself. What they fear is losing their sense of control within love. They worry about becoming emotionally dependent. They fear being relied upon or feeling responsible for another person's emotional world. Through your relationship, all of those fears surfaced at once. Ironically, it wasn't your emotional calm that reassured them. It activated deeply rooted survival responses. Healthy relationships require trust, openness, and the willingness to lower emotional defenses. Yet if trust once led to pain, betrayal, or disappointment, surrendering to genuine closeness can feel dangerous rather than comforting. You entered their life at the point where those emotional limits could no longer stay hidden. Your relationship revealed the boundaries of what they were emotionally prepared to handle. If they stepped away, it wasn't necessarily because your love was excessive or because you somehow failed. More often, it reflected the fact that their emotional capacity had not yet grown enough to hold the kind of connection you offered. Their withdrawal was primarily an act of self-protection, not always a reflection of your worth. They retreated because their internal defenses became overwhelmed, not because your value suddenly disappeared. Even after the relationship ends, many avoidant individuals carry quiet regret. They replay conversations they never fully processed and revisit memories they never allowed themselves to emotionally experience. They often struggle to put those feelings into words. They can miss someone deeply while convincing themselves to remain silent. The absence of a meaningful connection frequently lingers far longer than they are willing to admit. Your role in their life also introduced something they may not have experienced before: real emotional consequences. Many avoidant individuals become accustomed to disconnecting whenever relationships begin to feel uncomfortable. Before, distancing themselves may have seemed relatively painless. But with you, the emotional cost became impossible to ignore. The loss felt genuine. The silence carried unexpected weight. The emptiness left behind became difficult to dismiss. That is one reason you may still occupy a place in their thoughts. It does not necessarily mean they are preparing to return or reconnect. More often, you remain significant because your relationship represents unfinished emotional work. You became a reminder of the version of themselves they were not yet ready to become, and of the growth they chose to avoid when the opportunity stood directly in front of them. It was a decision they simply weren't prepared to make. Your arrival in their life forced them to face something they had spent years postponing. It wasn't that the relationship appeared at the wrong moment by accident. It exposed that they were not yet emotionally ready for healing, genuine vulnerability, or the level of commitment that real intimacy requires. Many people with avoidant attachment patterns encounter someone who is capable of loving them well before they are capable of fully receiving that love. You entered their life to reveal the gap between what they desired and what they were emotionally prepared to sustain. That realization is rarely comfortable. It often creates inner conflict instead of clarity. Confusion replaces certainty. Emotional distance replaces closeness. Silence replaces honest conversation. These reactions are not always signs that the connection lacked meaning. Sometimes they are evidence of an internal struggle that the avoidant person doesn't yet know how to navigate. Ironically, many avoidant individuals recognize the value of a relationship most clearly after it is gone. Distance creates space for reflection, Absence removes distractions and forces emotions that were previously ignored to surface. The lessons they resisted while you were present often become impossible to overlook after you leave. That doesn't mean the relationship failed. It means your role may have been different from what you originally believed. You were never meant to carry the responsibility of saving them. In many ways, you served as a catalyst. A catalyst doesn't remain forever, nor does it complete the entire transformation itself. Its purpose is to begin a process that continues long after it is gone. Quietly, and often without immediate recognition, it changes the direction of what comes next. That was your role. You initiated self-reflection. You invited them to confront parts of themselves they had spent years avoiding. Whether they choose to face those truths or continue running from them is a decision only they can make. Their healing has never been something another person could accomplish on their behalf. Growth for avoidant individuals is often slow and deeply personal. It usually happens behind closed doors, away from the view of others. In many cases, meaningful change doesn't begin until the emotional consequences of avoidance become impossible to ignore. Sometimes loss becomes the experience that finally encourages the self-examination they had resisted for years. If that happened, your absence became part of that journey. You also taught them something many avoidant individuals struggle to accept: that authentic connection always requires a price. It asks for emotional honesty instead of emotional hiding. It demands the courage to remain present through discomfort instead of escaping it. It requires facing fears that have long been protected by emotional distance. For many people with avoidant attachment, pain feels strangely familiar. They have learned how to survive it. Courage, however, asks them to step into the unknown. It asks them to change old habits, lower protective walls, and risk emotional disappointment in exchange for genuine closeness. That kind of transformation is often far more frightening than remaining in familiar patterns. Because you represented the possibility of that change, resistance became their instinctive response. One of the biggest mistakes people make after loving an avoidant partner is believing that their value depends on whether that person chose to stay. When the relationship ends, it's easy to assume, if I had been more attractive, more patient, more understanding, or simply more lovable, they would have fought for us. But that conclusion often misses what was actually happening beneath the surface. Your worth was never determined by their ability to maintain emotional closeness. Their decision to withdraw says far more about their internal capacity than it does about your value. Someone can deeply appreciate another person and still lack the emotional readiness to sustain a healthy relationship. Those two realities can exist at the same time. Your significance in their life reached far beyond whether the relationship lasted. Long before the distance appeared, you changed the way they experienced emotional intimacy. You introduced them to a kind of connection that may have felt unfamiliar. Instead of emotional games, inconsistency, or unpredictability, you offered presence. Instead of forcing closeness, you created safety. Instead of demanding perfection, you simply showed up with consistency. For someone who has spent years protecting themselves from vulnerability, that kind of relationship is powerful. It quietly challenges beliefs they have carried since childhood. Many avoidant individuals grow up believing that depending on others is dangerous, that emotional needs create disappointment, or that independence is the only reliable source of safety. Those beliefs eventually become part of their identity. Then someone like you enters their life. Without trying to change them, you begin questioning those beliefs simply through the way you love. Your reliability challenges their expectation that people always leave. Your emotional openness challenges their belief that vulnerability is weakness. Your consistency questions the story they have repeated to themselves for years, that closeness always ends in pain. Even if they never say it aloud, experiences like that leave a lasting impression. People often imagine emotional impact as something dramatic, but the deepest influence is usually much quieter. It happens in the moments they remember months or even years later. It appears when they compare future relationships to the emotional safety they once experienced with you. It surfaces when they recognize familiar avoidance patterns they never noticed before. That is why meaningful connections rarely disappear completely. The relationship may end, but the awareness it created often remains. There is another truth that many people struggle to accept, especially after heartbreak. Not every important relationship is meant to become a lifelong partnership. Some people arrive in our lives to awaken parts of ourselves that have been asleep for years. Others challenge beliefs we have never questioned. Some relationships expose unhealthy patterns that neither person could see before they met. Their purpose is not necessarily permanence. Sometimes their greatest purpose is transformation. Think about how many people can look back years later and recognize that one particular relationship completely changed the way they understood love, even though it did not last. The relationship itself ended, but the lessons remained. Those lessons shaped every relationship that followed. That is often the role a meaningful connection plays in the life of someone with avoidant attachment. Your presence awakened emotional experiences they had spent years suppressing. Beneath layers of independence, emotional distance, and self-protection, there was still a natural desire for closeness. Your relationship brought those hidden needs into the light. What they choose to do after that awakening is something only they can decide. Some people eventually face those fears. They begin therapy, practice emotional vulnerability, and slowly build healthier relationship patterns. Others continue avoiding the discomfort because change requires confronting painful memories they have spent years escaping. No matter which path they choose, one thing becomes very difficult to erase. They cannot completely forget how they felt with you. They may suppress those memories. They may avoid talking about them. They may convince themselves the relationship wasn't important. But the nervous system remembers experiences that challenged old emotional patterns. They also cannot erase what you reflected back to them. You became a mirror, showing both their ability to love and the fears preventing them from fully expressing that love. Looking into that mirror was uncomfortable because it revealed possibilities they were not yet ready to embrace. Once someone has seen that reflection, it becomes difficult to pretend it never existed. Even more importantly, they cannot fully forget the version of themselves that briefly emerged while they were with you. For a period of time, they allowed themselves to experience greater openness, deeper affection, or emotional closeness than they normally would. Even if they later retreated behind familiar defenses, those moments remain part of their story. They know, on some level, that another version of themselves exists beneath the protective walls. That awareness often stays with them long after the relationship has ended. So if you've spent months or even years questioning your worth because they walked away, it may be time to ask a different question. Instead of asking why they couldn't stay, ask whether they were emotionally capable of holding the kind of relationship you offered. Those are very different questions. Your value was never limited by the size of their emotional capacity. Their readiness and your worth are not the same thing. You were never too much. You didn't love too deeply. You weren't too caring, too emotionally available, or too consistent. What you offered simply required a level of emotional maturity and vulnerability they had not yet developed. Sometimes the deepest tragedy is not that someone was loved too much. It's that they encountered genuine love before they were ready to receive it. And that reality should never become the measure of your value. It should simply remind you that another person's emotional limitations can explain their choices without defining your worth.